Well, with the federal government now spruiking the idea that rising house prices could and possibly should go on forever in a virtuous upward spiral, there was a cautionary note today from the Reserve Bank governor.
What's happening in housing in Sydney is clearly, I find it acutely concerning for a host of reasons, many of which are not to do with monetary policy. I think it's a social problem. I think some of what's happening is crazy.
When it comes to crazy, Glenn Stevens was not talking about the strange politics of housing affordability, but rather the problems caused by steeply rising property prices in Australia's largest city. Evidently aware of this problem, the Treasurer, Joe Hockey, revealed yesterday that he dobbed in one of his own neighbours as a suspicious foreign investor. The fellow in question may or may not be an Oriental gentleman known locally as the Chinese Gatsby. But this noble act of social conscience was not enough to divert headlines away from another piece of advice the Treasurer offered up.
The starting point for a first home buyer is to get a good job that pays good money.
Unsurprisingly, social media, dominated as it is by the younger demographic which is now chasing the receding dream of buying a house, went feral. This image alone was retweeted hundreds of times, while multiple versions of the Treasurer in drag as Marie Antoinette were also shared widely. There'd been nothing like this since Mr Hockey argued that poor people don't drive cars, or that time he was caught enjoying a sneaky cigar before delivering the toughest budget anyone could remember. Anyway, all this causes us to reflect on the kind of job that might be helpful if you do want to get into the housing market in the most painless way possible. There's one obvious occupation, and Joe Hockey himself once answered the metaphorical help wanted ad. Yes, that's right, the answer is Federal Member of Parliament. Here's our Canberra correspondent Tom Ingleton on the saga of the house that Joe Hockey bought and you're helping to pay for.
Once again, the Treasurer's battling the impression he's out of touch. This was his effort to explain himself this morning.
In Sydney and Melbourne, some other parts of Australia, housing is very hard, very expensive, and I understand that. I totally understand that.
But how much does the Treasurer understand? He and his wife own 4 properties between them, including this one in Canberra.
Hey!
Lovely.
Bought in 1997, not long after Mr Hockey came into Parliament.
Beautiful Canberra day.
Set in the prestigious suburb of Forest, it cost he and his wife and father about $320,000, a bargain even then. It's now worth around $2 million.
When you're earning $300,000 or $400,000 a year, you own a $2 million crash pad in Canberra, you're getting paid $271 a night to sleep in it by taxpayers, and it's owned by your wife. I think some people would say that that's a good deal.
That $271 is the travel allowance paid to all politicians for every day they come to Canberra for work. The allowance was designed to cover hotel bills, but increasingly politicians of all stripes have been more creative about how they use it.
Did that actually go into the mortgage?
Well, Tony, I don't know. I pay rent. And you know, if it's...
Well, you pay rent to your
hang
wife.
on. Well, is there a problem with that?
Not in the eyes of the Department of Finance that administers the allowance, and Joe Hockey is not the only politician who effectively pays himself rent.
I just get the impression that, you know, it's a different rule in Canberra, and it looks like the age of entitlement hasn't ended there.
Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but it's not. I mean, it applies for all politicians.
News Limited's Samantha Maiden broke the story of just how much the Hockeys have claimed under the allowance.
That under the existing rules, they have claimed, I think it was about $100,000 in travel allowance over the term of just the last Parliament.
But where it gets murky is how much of that went toward his wife's mortgage.
You would have to expect that $100,000 worth of travel allowance would help pay it off in some way, but Mr Hockey makes the point that he pays rent to his wife. Now, we don't know what that rent is. In many cases, it hasn't been just Mr Hockey living in that house. There's been other MPs and other ministers. Brendan Nelson famously lived in the shed.
Well, he had no money.
Right.
And he said, mate, I want to live outside and in the shed.
Mr Hockey hasn't just been a politician in Canberra.
It's not too bad. I mean, it's
oh my
it's a little musty.
He's also effectively been a property agent.
There's only enough power for the lights or the heater. You can't have it on at once, so Brendan never complained about it.
And his tenants all claimed the same travel allowance, potentially helping them pay their rent to his wife.
Well, it was Bob Baldwin, member for Patterson, Brendan Nelson, who lived in the Summer Palace out the back, and myself and Ross Cameron, the member for Parramatta.
I stay in a basic but comfortable motel in Canberra.
One independent senator's now calling on his colleagues to come clean about their taxpayer-funded Canberra lifestyles.
If an MP is using their allowance to pay off a home for themselves or for their spouse, I don't think it's unfair to require transparency for that accommodation to be publicly made available in terms of the arrangement being made available, and when the house or flat is eventually sold, then I think it's fair enough to find out whether that MP or their spouse made a capital gain or not.
And if they do,
I like the idea of a portion of that capital gain being put back into Treasury's coffers, although the flip side to that is that if the housing market crashes and the MP makes a loss, I don't think taxpayers would want to subsidise a bad investment decision by an MP.
the travel allowance isn't the only property perk for politicians. Some qualify for even more special treatment.
They can buy a house, get the $271 a night, and also claim a tax deduction for the cost of that loan on that property. It's not negative gearing, it's under a 1999 tax ruling of the ATO. So there's some...
So is that just for politicians?
That's just for politicians.
The house that your tax dollars helped buy for the Hockeys is here in the fashionable Canberra district of Marnica. There's no suggestion of any impropriety. The use of the travel allowance was completely within the rules. And the Hockeys' canny investment decision is no more sinister than proof of the Treasurer's financial nous. But the question is, could the Hockeys have afforded their place without the perks of high office? Senator Xenophon says Joe Hockey's comments were not just out of touch, but perhaps a sign the government's chosen sides between the haves and the have-nots in the property market.
It just seems to me that the government might be putting their lips on that dog whistle when it comes to property ownership, and that's not a good thing.